welcome to today's episode of Christian Answers program, and I'm happy that you can be with us today for the program. What I'm going to be doing today is doing a couple book reviews. I just recently ran into a couple books by the author Stephen Meyer, and this is one of the books. It's called Signature in the Cell. And then he has another book out called Darwin's Doubt. And both of these books, they're pretty sizable books if you look at them. The first one, Signature in the Cell, is roughly around 600 pages. And the second book, Darwin's Doubts, is a little bit shorter. It's around 540 pages. So they're pretty intense, and they're pretty big books. And they get into some pretty technical information, but what they're basically all about. The first one, Signature in the Cell, was put out about 5 years ago, and it basically outlines the argument for intelligent design, the detection of intelligent design, that there is a creator in nature that has produced some of the structures that we see in nature, and that only intelligent design can explain how these structures exist. As you know, in our society, in our secular society today, our modern secular society, the dominant philosophy in science has been Darwin's theory of evolution, and that has pretty much been the staple explanation as to why things are the way they are in nature. But the book, The Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer, seeks to refute that explanation, that natural explanation of Darwin's evolution, and basically approaches the whole topic from a standpoint of the DNA code. If you look at the DNA, I'm sure all of you have heard of the phrase DNA code, and that's what is found in every cell in the human body. Every cell in any living organism consists of a DNA code, and that code tells the living organism and the cells what to do. Now, the DNA is made up of a digital code, and it functions very much like software in a computer. Now, the question that Stephen Meyer raises is, where did that code come from? Well, Darwin's theory of evolution says that nature came up with that code somehow, and then started reproducing that code and started making variations on that code, and all of what we see in the living world, all of the organisms that we see on the planet Earth, are the product of nature coming up with the code and then doing variations on that code throughout time and all the epochs of history. And so that is the natural explanation. That's Darwin's theory of evolution. That's the explanation that the theory gives. Now, Stephen Meyer wants to say, wait a minute, where did the code come up with in the first place? And he wants to show through this 600 pages of the book Signature in the Cell, he wants to show that nature cannot come up with the code. It would be like asking a computer to create its own operating system. If you're familiar with computers, you realize that all of the hardware, all of the physical components of the computer cannot make the computer work. Only thing those can do is provide the components to run the software. The software is the actual code that tells all of the hardware components what to do. For example, in your computer, whether you know it or not, there is a storage disk. There might be 1 or 2 storage disks, and that's where the memory of the computer is. Then there is the processing unit. That's the processor that runs the heart of the computer and sends the impulses and the electrical bits of data to where they should be. Then there's the output circuitry, there's the input circuitry, there's all kinds of things, the motherboard, and all of the peripherals that connect to the motherboard. All of those things are hardware. But what is at the heart of a computer is the software, and the software is the code that tells all of the information what to do and where to go. And if you don't have software, you cannot have a working computer. Just because all of the hardware components are in place does not mean a computer will work. It has to have software. Now, in the biological world, the hardware would be the same as all of the raw materials for our bodies or any living body. You would have to have carbon, and you would have to have certain molecules to create a structure for an organism. But even with all of those hardware components, you might say hardware in computer terminology, you would still not have a functioning living being, because you would have to have the DNA code. And the code has to come from somewhere. Now, what the argument here in Stephen Meyer's book is that the only way that code can be generated is for an intelligent being to generate that code. That's the only way we know of. That's the only cause that we're familiar with that can generate code, and that is a human intelligence. And so his question is, if we see digital code being generated in nature, we have to ask ourselves the question, who put it there? What intelligence put it there? And that's a good question to ask, because it isn't being asked today enough in our universities and in our intellectual circles. It is simply assumed that nature itself put the code there. And that is a false assumption. That is a problematic assumption, because as we know as human beings, the only experience that we know of is that if you have a code, if there's some written sequence of code written, it's only going to come from an intelligent being. It cannot come from self-generation. It would be like having all of the parts of a computer and asking the computer to come up with a code for itself. And that would be impossible for the computer to come up with a code for itself. It would have to have the operating system in order to first operate, in order to do anything. And it's the same way with biological organisms. You cannot take the raw materials, of life and ask those raw materials, those components, to assemble themselves into a living organism, because they need a digital code to do that, and that code is found in the DNA molecule. Now that DNA molecule, as Watson and Crick, those are the scientists who actually mapped it out, the DNA molecule is in every sense a digital code. It has 4 digits, and all of the instructions for life are sent on those 4 digits, combinations of those 4 digits. And every single cell in your body, every single cell in every organism that's alive has a DNA code. And the question that Stephen Meyer raises, and it's a good question, is who wrote that code? Now, like I said before, Darwin's theory of evolution says the nature wrote the code. But the problem with that is we have no experience, we have no observational information that nature can write a code. The only code writing that we are familiar with is that of an intelligent designer who designs a code. We have companies like Microsoft, we have companies like Apple Computer, and they hire expert computer code writers to write their code for their operating systems and their software. And these guys are specialized, and they are highly intelligent, and they're highly skilled, and they know how to write really sophisticated computer code. And what they do is they are basically writing instructions for the hardware of the computer, telling the hardware what to do so as to carry out the work that we need to do on our computers every day. So every time you use a computer, you are using both hardware and software. And you cannot use an operating computer without software. You need somebody to have coded a program to tell the hardware what to do. And that's the same way in nature. Nothing can live and be a living organism without someone writing the DNA code, telling the different raw materials, the natural materials that make up the organism in our bodies, telling the cells what to do. Because if there were no code, there would be no life. And his basic argument in Signature in the Cell is that intelligent design is a better explanation to the origin of life than is nature. Now, Darwin's theory of evolution basically says that at some remote time in the far distant past, chemicals somehow got together and they assembled themselves into a simple code. And that code came together somehow, some way. Darwin thought it was perhaps in a warm pond of ooze, chemical ooze. Maybe lightning struck the pond and somehow jolted and jarred the chemicals together in such a way that they formed a code called DNA. And that DNA then began to operate on the surrounding raw material and produced the first living organism. That's the Darwin's theory of evolution way of explaining it. Well, as Stephen Meyer explains in the Signature in the Cell, that has no basis in. We have no experience of a code ever coming together and being produced by anything other than an intelligent agent. It would be like, for example, if you were to take a pile of computer components, and sometimes you see these in the landfills where there are some old computers and they're throwing away electronic parts, and you see all these computer parts. You see some old hard drives, you see old monitors, you see old motherboards, and you see old cases, and all these computer parts in a landfill, and you throw all of these things together, and somehow, some way, the computer gets assembled, and some way, somehow, there is a operating system that is written somehow accidentally, not being produced by any intelligent being, not purposely designed, but just accidentally fell together, and all of a sudden you have a computer that starts to operate and work on its own. That is ridiculous. From all of our experience, we have no experience of any code ever being written by anything other than a human intelligence. And so when we look at the DNA molecule, we also have to realize that it is ridiculous to think that in some warm little pond, even with lightning strikes and all of the other forces acting upon it, it would be ridiculous to think that somehow a code could be written not by an intelligent designer, but by simply accidentally being written, and then from there it begins to operate life. That would be ridiculous, and that's what Darwin's theory of evolution forces us to believe, and it doesn't make sense. Now, what Stephen Meyer does in this book is shows that you need a code writer to get code, and you need an initial designer to get the DNA code going, and the best explanation is that God himself, as an intelligent designer, created and designed the DNA molecule. That is the best explanation for life. So I highly recommend this book. It's called Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer. It is a good treatment on why Darwin's theory does not explain the origin of life, and why we need a better explanation, and the best explanation is intelligent design. The designer is God himself. God wrote the original DNA code. He wrote it just as if a computer software designer were to design an operating system. God himself was the original software designer, and he designed the original DNA code that is now used in every living thing. And so that's the best explanation of how it got there. So that's the signature in the cell. So if you get a chance to read that book, I would highly recommend Signature in the Cell. But let me go on to the next book by Stephen P. Meyer in just a second. But don't go away. We'll be back to our second portion of Christian Answers. All right, we're back here at Christian Answers for the second segment, and I'm going to be talking about another book by Stephen Meyer. It's called Darwin's Doubt. Now, in the first book that I talked about today, he was dealing with the origin of biological life. How did the first life form, the first organism, come about? Well, if you're a Darwinian evolutionist, you believe that it came about by accident. You have to believe that somehow nature and the forces of nature wrote a digital code. Not any person. If you believe in Darwinian evolution, you have to believe that nature wrote the code, the first code. Nature was the first programmer. Nature was the first digital programmer who wrote the code of life. That's what you have to believe. He shows in the Signature in the Cell, the first book I reviewed, that doesn't make any sense, because the only cause that we know of that exists, that's verifiable, that's observable, that can produce code, is an intelligent cause, and that is the intelligent design of God Almighty, who created the first DNA molecule. Now, the second book that Stephen Meyer is talking about it's called Darwin's Doubt. Now, what does Darwin's Doubt have to do with any of the things that I've talked about before? Well, Darwin's Doubt deals with the mystery in the fossil record of an event called the Cambrian explosion. And this event supposedly occurred 500 to 600 million years ago, if we accept the long view of history, and if we accept science's dating scheme. 500 to 600 million years ago, all of a sudden, the modern body styles of almost all the organisms that we know of today suddenly occurred. And before them, there were only simple animals, simple organisms, and then between 500 and 600 years old, million years ago, all of a sudden, the major body types and body styles of all the organisms suddenly appeared. Now, why is this a problem for Darwin's theory of evolution? It's a problem because according to the theory of evolution, everything gradually developed from a single-celled organism. According to Darwin's theory of evolution, nature produced the first single-celled organism, and then evolution developed more complex animals and more complex organisms, and then on and on and on and on and on, more development until we have human beings today. And that's all a gradual process according to Darwin. And then you would, of course, find a gradual development in the fossil record, but that is not the case. All of a sudden, we see simple organisms occurring, and then, boom, we see this Cambrian explosion, and we see these kind of animals. This is a trilobite, and we see all of the major body styles that we see today happening at the Cambrian explosion 500 to 600 million years ago, according to the scientific timetable. So why did that happen? How could Darwin's theory of evolution explain the Cambrian explosion? Well, it can't explain it, because according to Darwin, there should have been all kinds of transitional animals leading up to the complex animals that we see formed in the Cambrian explosion. So where are these transitional types? Where are all the developed creatures leading up to the Cambrian explosion that we should see in the fossil record? Well, they're not there. So where are they? Well, according to Stephen C. Meyer, they're not there because they don't exist. And the reason they don't exist is because these animals didn't transition from a small single-celled organism into the complex organisms we see today. They all of a sudden appeared as if designed and produced within a relatively short period of time. Now, between 500 million and 600 million years, that's 100 million years. So it's not as if it's a totally short period of time, but in the geological perspective, that is a rather short period of time. And you would expect that under Darwin's theory you would expect all kinds of transitional organisms leading up to the Cambrian explosion, but you don't get that. And so he makes the argument in his book Darwin's Doubt that this is proof that Darwin's theory of evolution, development based on mutation and natural selection cannot explain the fossil evidence. And the only thing that can explain the fossil evidence, the only thing that can explain the sudden appearance of fully developed body styles in the fossil record, is intelligent design. As if someone or something, intelligent someone or something, put these there purposefully, on purpose, that they did not gradually develop from simpler animals, because if they had developed gradually from simple organisms, we would see the evidence in the fossil record. It would be clear, everyone could see it. In fact, you would see a blending of transitional organisms, all the way from the very simple ones all the way up to the most complex one, and the fossil record would show that blending, and it would show the evidence of natural selection through mutations, but it doesn't show that. All of a sudden it has these animals that are pretty sophisticated as far as their body styles and body types. They're not in any way showing this gradual development as what Darwin said would be there. Now, Darwin, according to the book, and according to his first major book, The Origin of the Species, said that it's because in his day, in the 1850s, that the fossil record had not been investigated thoroughly. And so he said in the future, in a later day, men will be digging around more and more into the fossil record, and they will find these transitional animals. They will see that there is a clear pattern of development from the single-celled organisms all the way up until the more sophisticated organisms. They will find that in the fossil record. We just don't have enough fossil evidence right now, he said back in the 1850s. Well, we're over 150 years later from Darwin's publication of Origin of the Species, and we still haven't found those transitional animals. And Darwin's speculation that they would be found after a lot of investigation is false. They were not found, and they have not been found. And there's no indication that they ever will be found now after 150 years, because the fossil record of the world has been dug up and dug over by hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of geologists and paleontologists. They've been looking for these transitional creatures that Darwin speculated would be there, and they have not found them. And so it looks like they're not going to find them. And the reason Stephen Meyer says they're not going to find them is because it looks like they never existed. It looks like as if you had these simple organisms, very basic, simple creatures, and then all of a sudden, more sophisticated creatures appear relatively suddenly, and then from that point on, they remain fairly stable all the way up until the present day. And so that totally shoots down this theory of gradual development that Darwin proposed in The Origin of the Species. And this totally refutes the Darwinian evolutionary account of biological history. Now, some people have said, and Stephen Meyer addresses this problem, some people have said, well, the reason you can't see these creatures, these transitional creatures, before the Cambrian explosion is because they had soft bodies. They didn't have the hard crust bones, and they had soft bodies, more like a jellyfish, and these things would not be preserved in the fossil record the way the larger, more sophisticated body forms would. The problem with that explanation is we do have creatures below the Cambrian, before the Cambrian explosion, with soft bodies, and they did have fossil record showing that they existed. So it doesn't mean that just because an organism has a soft body and not a hard body, that the soft-bodied creatures will not show up in the fossil record. There are plenty of soft-bodied creatures that do show up in the fossil record, and they are the primitive type, and they are not in any way showing a transitional step-by-step process leading up to the more sophisticated body types. And so that is not an explanation as to why these fossils that should be there, according to Darwin, are not being found. And so Stephen Meyer goes through different arguments as to why these fossils are not going to be found, and how they couldn't even in principle have developed on their own through natural means. Well, I hope that that's been of interest to you, and I hope to see you back here next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.